Marcus Thompson had been protecting celebrities for 15 years, but he'd never encountered anything like what he witnessed during his 18 months as Chester Bennington's personal bodyguard. 4 or 5 years after Chester's death, Marcus kept the secret that could have changed everything. But when he finally decided to speak, what he revealed about Chester's hidden life would shock the world and rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Linkin Park frontman's final months. This isn't the story of a rock star's public struggles. This is the story of what happened when the cameras stopped rolling, when the interviews ended, when Chester thought no one was watching. This is the story of a secret so profound, so unexpected, that Marcus struggled for years with whether he should ever tell it. And when you hear what Chester Bennington was really doing in his final months, you'll understand why this revelation changes absolutely everything. Marcus Thompson wasn't your typical celebrity bodyguard. A former Navy SEAL with a background in crisis intervention and emergency medicine, Marcus had been hired specifically because of his unique skill set. Chester's management team had been concerned about his mental health, his history of substance abuse, and his increasingly erratic behavior. They needed someone who could protect Chester not just from external threats, but from himself. When I first got the assignment, I thought it would be standard celebrity protection, Marcus revealed in his exclusive interview. High-profile client, paparazzi management, crowd control at events. I had no idea I was about to witness something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about human nature. Marcus began working for Chester in January 2016, 18 months before Chester's death. His job was to provide discreet 24/7 protection, staying close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to give Chester the illusion of privacy and normalcy. Chester was different from other celebrities I'd worked with, Marcus recalled. Most famous people have this wall up, this persona they maintained even in private. But Chester was just raw, real. What you saw was what you got, which made him incredibly vulnerable, but also incredibly genuine. For the first few months, Marcus's job was routine. He accompanied Chester to recording sessions, concerts, public appearances, and family events. Chester was dealing with depression and occasionally drinking too much, but nothing Marcus hadn't handled before with other clients. But then, in April 2016, something changed. Chester started making these mysterious trips, Marcus explained. 2, sometimes 3 times a week, always at night, always alone. He'd tell me he was going for a drive to clear his head, and he'd be gone for hours. My job was to protect him, which meant I had to follow. The first few times Chester made these nocturnal journeys, Marcus assumed he was meeting with dealers, visiting bars, or engaging in some other self-destructive behavior that celebrities often turn to when struggling with mental health issues. Marcus prepared himself to intervene if necessary. I expected to find him in dive bars, drug houses, maybe having affairs, Marcus admitted. I'd seen it all before with other clients. But what I actually discovered was something I never could have imagined. Chester's secret destination was a 24-hour homeless shelter in downtown Los Angeles called Hope Haven. But he wasn't there as a celebrity making a publicity visit or writing a check for charity. Chester Bennington was there as a volunteer, working the overnight shift, serving meals, cleaning, and providing crisis counseling to some of the city's most vulnerable people. The first night I followed him there, I thought maybe it was a one-time thing, Marcus said. Maybe he was meeting someone or had some other agenda. But I watched him through the windows, and I saw Chester Bennington mopping floors, washing dishes, and sitting with homeless people who had no idea who he was. Marcus was shocked, but what happened over the following weeks was even more surprising. Chester wasn't just volunteering randomly. He had established a routine, developed relationships with the shelter residents, and was providing services that went far beyond typical volunteer work. Chester was using his experience with addiction and depression to counsel people who were struggling with the same issues, Marcus revealed. But he was doing it anonymously. He went by the name Chris and told people he was a construction worker who understood what it was like to hit rock bottom. Marcus learned that Chester had been volunteering at Hope Haven for over 2 years before Marcus was hired, long before anyone on his management team or even his family knew about it. Chester had discovered the shelter during one of his lowest periods and had started volunteering as a way to find purpose and perspective during his own struggles. One night, I watched Chester talk a suicidal veteran out of overdosing, Marcus recounted. This guy was about to inject himself with a lethal dose of heroin, and Chester sat with him for 4 hours, sharing his own story, his own battles with wanting to end the pain. He saved that man's life, and no one will ever know Chester Bennington did it. But Chester's involvement with Hope Haven went deeper than just volunteering. Marcus discovered that Chester had been secretly funding major improvements to the shelter: new kitchen equipment, additional beds, a medical clinic, and a counseling center. All of it donated anonymously through shell corporations that couldn't be traced back to him. Chester was spending hundreds of thousands of his own money on this place, Marcus revealed. But he was doing it in a way that no one could ever connect it to him. He didn't want credit, didn't want publicity. He just wanted to help. The most remarkable part wasn't the money Chester was donating, but the personal relationships he had developed with the shelter residents. Marcus watched Chester become a father figure to runaway teenagers, a brother to struggling addicts, and a counselor to people dealing with mental illness. There was this kid, maybe 17, named Jamie, who had been living on the streets for 2 years, Marcus shared. Chester took him under his wing, helped him get into a GED program, found him a job. Jamie had no idea he was being mentored by one of the most famous rock stars in the world. To Jamie, Chester was just Chris, the guy who believed in him when no one else did. But Jamie's story was just one of many. Marcus witnessed Chester's impact on dozens of lives during his time as bodyguard. There was Maria, a single mother who had lost her apartment and was living in her car with her 8-year-old daughter. Chester quietly arranged for them to get temporary housing and helped Maria find stable employment. Chester would show up at Maria's job interview, pretending to be just another applicant, but he'd already spoken to the hiring manager beforehand, Marcus revealed. He wanted to make sure she got the position, but he also wanted to be there for moral support without her knowing he had arranged it. Then there was Robert, a Vietnam veteran suffering from PTSD and severe depression. Robert had been in and out of the shelter system for 15 years, and most volunteers had given up on him. But Chester saw something in Robert that others missed. Chester would sit with Robert for hours, just listening to his war stories. Marcus recalled. Robert had been carrying guilt about things he'd done and seen in Vietnam, and Chester understood that kind of psychological burden. They formed this incredible bond built on shared trauma and mutual respect. Chester helped Robert get into a veteran's mental health program and even attended some of his therapy sessions as emotional support. Robert didn't know his friend Chris was famous. He just knew that this man understood his pain in a way that felt genuine and healing. One night, Robert told Chester that he was the first person in decades who had looked at him like a human being instead of a problem to be solved. Marcus shared. Chester started crying right there in the shelter, and Robert held him while Chester processed his own childhood trauma. It was like watching two broken people heal each other. Marcus began to understand that Chester's secret volunteer work wasn't just charity, it was therapy. Helping others work through their trauma was helping Chester process his own demons in ways that traditional therapy hadn't been able to accomplish. Chester would come home from the shelter different, Marcus observed. Calmer, more centered, like he'd found something that made sense of his own pain. Those nights at Hope Haven were the only times I ever saw Chester truly at peace with himself. The transformation was remarkable to witness. During the day, Chester would struggle with anxiety about upcoming concerts, stress about media scrutiny, and the weight of being responsible for other people's emotional well-being through his music. But at night, at the shelter, those burdens seemed to lift. At the shelter, Chester wasn't performing for anyone, Marcus explained. He wasn't Chester Bennington the rock star who had to be strong for his fans. He was just Chris, someone who understood pain and wanted to help others carry their burdens. It was the most authentic version of himself I ever saw. Marcus also learned about the sophisticated system Chester had developed to maintain his anonymity while maximizing his impact. Chester used different names at different shelters, wore disguises when necessary, and had developed relationships with social workers who could help him navigate bureaucratic obstacles for the people he was trying to help. Chester had basically created an underground network of people who knew Chris but didn't know Chester, Marcus revealed. Social workers, job placement specialists, therapists, housing coordinators. All of them worked with this generous, mysterious man who seemed to appear whenever someone desperately needed help. The financial scope of Chester's secret charity was staggering. Marcus discovered that Chester had been spending approximately 40% of his annual income on anonymous charitable works, far beyond just the homeless shelter. He was paying for rehab programs, medical treatments, housing deposits, education costs, and emergency interventions for people he'd met through his volunteer work. Chester had a whole separate accounting system for his charity work, Marcus revealed. He called it his real work budget, and it was managed through multiple shell corporations and nonprofit partnerships. The paper trail was incredibly complex. Chester didn't want anyone, including the IRS, to be able to connect these donations back to him. But Chester's involvement wasn't just financial. Marcus watched him develop genuine, long-term relationships with the people he helped. He remembered their birthdays, attended their graduations, celebrated their sobriety milestones, and grieved with them during setbacks. There was this woman named Linda who had been clean from heroin for 6 months, Marcus shared. When she relapsed, Chester didn't abandon her or judge her. He sat with her in the emergency room, helped get her back into treatment, and visited her every week until she was stable again. Linda thought Chris was just an unusually dedicated volunteer, but Chester was investing his heart in her recovery. Marcus also witnessed the toll this secret life was taking on Chester's mental health. The weight of so many people's problems, combined with his own struggles, was overwhelming. Chester was carrying emotional burdens for dozens of people, Marcus observed. He knew their deepest traumas, their biggest fears, their most desperate hopes. And because he was doing it anonymously, he couldn't share that load with anyone else. He was basically doing the job of multiple social workers, therapists, and counselors, all while hiding his identity. The irony became more apparent as Chester's public struggles intensified. Media reports painted him as someone who was falling apart, but Marcus saw a man who was simultaneously saving lives on a regular basis. The same week that tabloids were running stories about Chester's drinking and depression, I watched him talk 3 different people out of suicide attempts, Marcus recalled. The public saw a troubled celebrity, but I saw someone who was using his own pain to become an expert at helping others survive theirs. But Chester's secret was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. His fame made anonymity challenging, and Marcus was concerned about what would happen if Chester's identity was discovered. There were close calls, Marcus admitted. A few times, people recognized his voice or thought he looked familiar. One night, a shelter resident who was a Linkin Park fan kept staring at Chester, and I thought for sure we were going to be exposed. Chester handled it by claiming he got that a lot because he supposedly had one of those faces. Chester's fear of exposure wasn't about his reputation. It was about preserving the authenticity of his relationships at the shelter. He was terrified that if people knew who he really was, they would start treating him differently, expecting more from him, or questioning his motives. Chester told me once that the shelter was the only place where people loved him for who he was, not what he could do for them, Marcus shared. He was afraid that if his identity was revealed, that pure connection would be contaminated by fame and expectations. The complexity of Chester's situation became more apparent as Marcus spent more time observing his double life. During the day, Chester was struggling with depression, dealing with the pressures of fame, and battling his own demons. But at night, at the shelter, he was the one providing hope and guidance to others facing similar battles. It was like he was 2 different people, Marcus explained. Public Chester was broken, struggling, often hopeless. But Chris at the shelter was wise, strong, and completely focused on helping others survive. It was like helping other people brought out the best version of himself that fame had buried. Marcus noticed that Chester's volunteer work followed a specific pattern related to his mental health cycles. On his worst days, when depression was overwhelming him, Chester would spend extra hours at the shelter, sometimes staying until dawn. The worse Chester felt about himself, the more he threw himself into helping others, Marcus observed. It was his way of fighting back against the darkness. When he couldn't save himself, he saved someone else. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. One particularly difficult period came in late 2016, when Chester was struggling with the anniversary of his childhood abuse. Instead of isolating himself or turning to destructive coping mechanisms, Chester spent almost every night at various shelters throughout Los Angeles. That whole month, Chester was like a guardian angel appearing wherever he was needed most, Marcus recalled. He prevented 2 suicide attempts, helped 4 people get into treatment programs, and personally funded emergency medical care for a homeless veteran who couldn't afford his medications. The most powerful moment Marcus witnessed came in February 2017, just 5 months before Chester's death. A young woman named Sarah had come to Hope Haven after a suicide attempt, and she was planning to try again as soon as she was discharged. Sarah was about the same age as Chester's daughter, and she reminded him of himself at that age, full of pain, feeling hopeless, convinced that no one could understand what she was going through, Marcus recalled. Chester spent the entire night with her, sharing things about his childhood abuse, his struggles with addiction, his battles with suicidal thoughts that he'd never told anyone else. Chester revealed to Sarah details about his own trauma that he'd never shared publicly, the specific nature of his childhood abuse, the ways it had shaped his relationship with himself and others, and the daily struggle of living with that kind of psychological damage. Chester told Sarah things that night that I don't think he'd ever said out loud before, Marcus shared. He was completely vulnerable, completely honest, because he knew that level of authenticity was what she needed to hear. By morning, Sarah had agreed to enter a treatment program, but more importantly, she had a reason to keep fighting. Chester arranged for Sarah's treatment to be funded anonymously through one of his shell corporations, and he stayed in touch with her throughout her recovery. Marcus learned that there were dozens of similar cases, people whose lives Chester had saved or transformed through his secret volunteer work. Chester had created this whole other family at the shelter, Marcus revealed. People who depended on him, looked up to him, loved him without knowing who he really was. He was Chris to them, and Chris was the version of Chester that wasn't broken by fame and trauma. As 2017 progressed and Chester's public struggles intensified, his commitment to the shelter work actually increased. Marcus began to worry that Chester was using volunteer work to avoid dealing with his own mental health needs, but also recognized that this work was the one thing keeping Chester anchored to life. Chester was pouring all his energy into saving other people, but he wasn't taking care of himself, Marcus observed. He was like a doctor who could heal everyone except himself. It was frustrating and inspiring at the same time. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that Chester was providing suicide prevention counseling to shelter residents while battling his own suicidal thoughts. Chester had become an expert at talking people out of ending their lives, even as his own desire to live was diminishing. There were nights when I watched Chester spend hours convincing someone else that their life was worth living, then sit in his car afterward crying because he couldn't convince himself of the same thing, Marcus shared. He had all the right words for other people, but he couldn't apply them to his own situation. Marcus also observed the unique way Chester approached each person's problems. He never used his own story as a way to minimize their pain or claim that he understood exactly what they were going through. Instead, he used his experiences to validate their feelings and show them that survival was possible. Chester would say things like, "I can't know exactly how you feel, but I know what it's like when the pain feels bigger than your ability to carry it," Marcus recalled. He never made it about him, never used his own trauma to one-up anyone else's suffering. He just offered his experience as proof that people could survive the unthinkable. In June 2017, just weeks before Chester's death, Marcus witnessed what would turn out to be one of Chester's final visits to Hope Haven. Chester was saying goodbye to people, though he didn't explicitly say he wouldn't be back. Chester gave Jamie a guitar that night, Marcus remembered. He told him it was time for Jamie to find his own voice, his own way of expressing the pain he'd survived. Jamie didn't know he was receiving a gift from Chester Bennington. He just knew that Chris believed in his potential. Marcus also noticed that Chester was making arrangements for the shelter's continued funding in his absence, setting up trusts and endowments that would continue supporting Hope Haven long after he was gone. Chester was planning for a future where he wouldn't be there to help directly, Marcus realized in hindsight. He was making sure the work would continue without him. The night before Chester's death, Marcus received an unusual request. Chester asked him to take a few days off to spend time with his own family. It was the first time in 18 months that Chester had dismissed his protection. "I should have known something was wrong," Marcus reflected. Chester had never sent me away before, but he seemed calmer than he'd been in months, like he'd made peace with something. I thought maybe he was finally getting better. When Marcus learned of Chester's death the next day, his first thought wasn't about the public tragedy or the loss to the music world. It was about the people at Hope Haven who were about to lose Chris, the man who had been their beacon of hope. "I had to go to the shelter that night to tell them," Marcus said, his voice breaking. These people who had no idea they'd been helped by a world-famous rock star were devastated. To them, they'd just lost a friend, a mentor, a lifeline. Marcus attended Chester's funeral, but he also organized a separate memorial service at Hope Haven. Dozens of homeless people, recovering addicts, and former shelter residents gathered to remember Chris, the man who had saved their lives without them ever knowing his real name. Jamie played the guitar Chester had given him. Marcus recalled, "He played Amazing Grace and dedicated it to Chris, who taught me that broken people can still help fix each other." 4 or 5 years after Chester's death, Marcus kept this secret. He wasn't sure if revealing Chester's volunteer work would honor his memory or violate the privacy Chester had worked so hard to maintain. Chester went to great lengths to keep his shelter work private, Marcus explained. He didn't want credit, didn't want recognition. He just wanted to help. "I struggled with whether telling this story would betray his trust or honor his legacy." Marcus finally decided to speak publicly after learning that Hope Haven was facing closure due to funding issues. The endowments Chester had established were running out, and the shelter needed public support to continue operating. Chester would want the work to continue, Marcus decided. He'd want Jamie and Sarah and all the others to have a place to go when they need help. If revealing his secret can save the shelter, I think Chester would understand. The revelation of Chester's secret volunteer work has transformed public understanding of his final years. Instead of seeing a man who was only struggling, people now see someone who is actively fighting his demons by helping others fight theirs. Chester Bennington wasn't just a victim of depression, Marcus reflected. He was a warrior who found a way to turn his pain into purpose. He may have lost his own battle, but he won the battle for dozens of other people who are alive today because Chris showed up at the shelter when they needed him most. Hope Haven has since been renamed the Chester Bennington Hope Center, and it continues to serve homeless and at-risk individuals using the same anonymous, unconditional approach that Chester pioneered. The center has expanded to include music therapy programs inspired by Chester's belief in music's healing power. Chester's secret wasn't something to be ashamed of, Marcus concluded. It was something beautiful, proof that even when we're drowning, we can still throw life preservers to others. Chester Bennington spent his final years saving lives, and now that we know his secret, his example is saving even more. Today, Jamie, now a successful musician and motivational speaker, performs concerts to raise funds for homeless shelters, carrying forward the legacy of the man he knew as Chris. Sarah has become a suicide prevention counselor, using the tools Chester taught her to help others find reasons to live. Chester's biggest secret wasn't dark or scandalous, Marcus revealed. It was light in the darkness, hope in despair, love in action. He proved that broken people can be the best healers, that those who understand pain are uniquely qualified to help others survive it. Marcus Thompson's revelation shows us a side of Chester Bennington that the world never saw. Not the tortured artist or the struggling celebrity, but the quiet hero who spent his nights saving strangers because saving them was the only way he knew how to save himself. In the end, Chester's secret wasn't about hiding something shameful. It was about doing something so purely good that he couldn't risk it being tainted by fame or recognition. And now that his secret is out, Chester Bennington's true legacy is even more powerful than his music. The understanding that no matter how much pain we carry, we can still be a source of healing for others.